So Chris gave us a good introduction to the climate change response framework, and he talked about 4 main components, and I'm going to be focusing on one of those components, which is assessing vulnerability. So what is climate change vulnerability? There are a number of different frameworks in place that people have used, but our group tends to use a framework of adaptive capacity and potential impacts. So if you have a lot of negative impacts and low capacity to adapt to those climate changes, you have high vulnerability. Whereas if a lot of the potential impacts of climate change on your system are relatively positive and you have a high ability to adapt to those changes, you have lower vulnerability. I'll just give you a very simple example to think about vulnerability. And this is using sunburn. So if you think about impacts, your impacts are your exposure, so how much sunlight you have, and your sensitivity, so are you fair-skinned, dark-skinned, sensitive to sunburn. And then your adaptive capacity is what do you do about it to prevent those impacts. So you could put on sunblock, you could go under an umbrella, and all of those things will contribute to how vulnerable you are to that sunburn. So why assess vulnerability? There are a number of reasons, and one main thing is to identify those species or ecosystems or human ecological systems that are at greatest risk. And this can help you prioritize your decision-making processes. And this doesn't mean that you need to necessarily focus on the things that are most vulnerable or least vulnerable, but it can help you identify those areas of your system that might contribute most to vulnerability, so you can focus on those. There might be other occasions where you try to focus more on building more resilient systems that have lower vulnerability, or you might prioritize trying to save those most vulnerable systems if there's some sort of intrinsic value to that system. And this is a key step to climate change adaptation. If we don't know what we're adapting to, we can't develop adaptation strategies. So as I said before, vulnerability assessments are a key step in that climate change response framework process, and I'm going to give you some overviews of how we've used vulnerability assessments and how we plan to use vulnerability assessments in urban systems. So a big question in vulnerability assessments is, what do you assess? Do you assess individual species? Do you assess ecosystems, infrastructure, human communities? A lot of times people think about trying to integrate all of those things, and all of those things can be important to assessing vulnerability. Another key question in assessing vulnerability is, how do you assess vulnerability? A lot of people rely on quantitative models, and you will hear from some of those people later today. Others rely mainly on expert opinion. So you realize that models don't tell you everything, and there are lots of complexities in the system. And then there are a number of people, and I will give you an example of what we've done, who try to integrate those two things, realizing that there are really important key components to both working with stakeholders and experts, and also to use those quantitative models. So first I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work that we have done in natural ecosystems across that broad climate change response framework area that Chris mentioned. So here, these systems are largely away from people, and so we have tended to focus primarily on tree species and forest ecosystems, and had less emphasis on that human and infrastructure component, although we do take those into consideration as well. And as I said before, what we try to do is focus on that intersection between using quantitative models and local expertise. And we have developed these vulnerability assessments through science manager workshops. We bring together groups of about 20 to 25 people from a variety of organizations, including the government, universities, non-governmental organizations, private industry, and tribes. And we try to get a mix of scientists and managers working together to think about these problems. And we've developed, this might look a little scary, but it's not. We developed an approach, assessment approach that we have employed in all of these different locations. And what we typically do is we start by looking at what are the current conditions of your ecosystem. What are the current threats? What are the current drivers? What are the dominant species in that system? Then we look at models and other information to assess what the potential impacts are on those ecosystems. How might climate change exacerbate current stressors or shift current drivers of those ecosystems or contribute to declines or increases in the dominant species. We look at interactions between those impacts, and then we think about the adaptive capacity of those systems. How high is the biodiversity? How resilient are those systems to disturbances such as fires or flooding or pest outbreaks? And we ask each of these experts in these workshops to assess on their own how vulnerable they think that system is. We then have them all share together and come up with a group determination of vulnerability. And we also assess uncertainty. How confident are we in our assessment based on what's currently available as far as model information and what's currently available as far as information on what really are the big threats and what is the inventory of the system. So we have currently completed vulnerability assessments for 5 areas across our footprint area. So that's the Central Hardwoods, the Central Appalachians, the Northwoods, which we divided it up into 3 different assessment areas. So what can we say generally about what we're finding in these vulnerability assessments? There are a number of key things that keep coming up again and again, identified by scientists and managers as major impacts. These include things like fire, drought, changes in soil moisture, changes in pests and pathogens, changes in wind, floods, and invasive species, among many others. But those are things that keep coming up. Key adaptive capacity factors identified in these assessments include things like how diverse the system is, the range of soil types and landforms, tolerance of fire, the influence of past or current management, the ability of the dominant species to disperse to new areas, regeneration, ability and success of dominant species, how widely distributed are those ecosystems on the landscape or how fragmented they are, the potential for other sites within the area to become favorable to that system, and the relative genetic diversity. So taking all that information, we're able to get an overall rating of vulnerability in these different areas. And so we assessed usually between 8 and 9 different forest and community types. And generally, those areas in the Northwoods tended to get more high vulnerability ratings than those farther to the south. Some of the other generalizations that we can make is a lot of the systems that are highly dominated by conifers tended to get higher vulnerability ratings. And this is because these tend to be your boreal ecosystems or your high elevation ecosystems. And so since those are adapted to colder climates, those tended to get higher vulnerability. The other thing that we noticed is a lot of the oak-dominated systems tended to get lower vulnerability ratings. The managers and scientists generally perceive them as more resilient to disturbance, and these tend to be more of those southern species. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about our urban forest ecosystems and how we assess vulnerability in those areas. So here we want to incorporate more of that infrastructure and human component because those are so integrated into our urban forests and they can't be ignored. So we have developed or are in the process of developing a pilot assessment across the Chicago wilderness area. And the idea is to use the tools developed here and the lessons learned to apply to other urban areas across the Midwest and Northeast. For urban areas, we have developed a sort of two-step approach where we are first assessing the vulnerability of tree species to climate change across the entire Chicago wilderness area. And then we're assessing vulnerability of individual urban forests within that larger area in specific municipalities and forest preserve districts and park districts using case studies. So first I'm going to talk just about the tree component, and you will hear a couple of modeling talks later today talking a little bit more about that component. So with tree species vulnerability, we're still thinking about that same framework of impacts and adaptive capacity. Now with potential impacts, we can assess tree species diversity using models or looking at changes in hardiness or heat zones, and some of the upcoming presentations will address that. What I'd like to spend some time talking about right now is changes in or the adaptive capacity of these ecosystems, or these trees. So in order to assess adaptive capacity, we've modified an approach from Louis Iverson and Steve Matthews, who will be giving a presentation next, where they have identified sort of these key factors for adaptive capacity in trees. And these are looking at disturbance factors such as pests and disease and fire and drought resistance, and then biological factors, so how shade tolerant is your tree, its adaptive specificity, its ability to propagate. And these biological and disturbance scores can then be put together into a score of overall adaptability. So there's a lot of things going on here, but the key thing is if you have a high biological and disturbance score, you have an overall high adaptive capacity. So we've developed two separate scores for tree species specific to the Chicago area. One for planted species in developed sites. This could be in a yard, boulevard, or campus. And we put a greater emphasis on urban factors such as pollution and salt tolerance. And things that are a bigger concern in natural systems like fire tolerance and invasive species competition get less of an emphasis in these planted trees. Then we also have a score for naturally occurring systems or species, and this can be both native and naturalized species. So it includes looking at how adaptable our invasive species are. And there we're putting a greater emphasis on things like fire tolerance and post-fire regeneration. So we overall assessed 179 species. Many of these are currently present in the Chicago wilderness area based on the regional tree census. We also added in another 59 species that are currently on planting lists in the area. And we included both native and non-native species and cultivars. So an example of what we're finding, this is for white pine. This is one of our lowest adaptability scored species. So white pine has a number of things going against it. High insect and disease susceptibility, relatively drought intolerant, intolerant of a lot of the extreme heat that we're expected to see here. And there's a limited range of planting sites in urban areas. Its adaptive capacity in natural systems is slightly higher, and that's because of a lot of those urban factors are not as big of a factor in those natural systems. On the other end of the spectrum, one with really high adaptive capacity is ironwood. And this is a tree that's relatively drought tolerant. It has a wide range of temperatures that it can tolerate, a wide range of planting sites that it can be tolerate, and it's a widely available species. And I think there was only one major negative point, which was the flood intolerance. And its natural system score is very similar to its planting score in this case. So relatively high adaptive capacity in both natural and planted areas. So if we look across all of the species that we assessed, how are we doing? And this is across all of the species in the regional tree census. If we look at all of the trees, including invasive species, what we see is about 43% are high adaptive capacity, 44% medium, and 13% low. But if we exclude invasive species from the mix, we see a lot fewer of those high adaptive capacity species. This shouldn't be surprising, seeing as invasive species have a high ability to adapt, which makes them invasive. So that was for residential areas, and this is for parks. Very similar story, where a lot of the things that have a high adaptive capacity are actually invasive. What? Exactly. Exactly. So next I'm going to give you a little foretaste of some of the work that we're doing to assess overall vulnerability of urban forests to climate change. And this is done at the municipal level or, like I said, the forest preserve or park district level. So here we're incorporating all of those aspects of vulnerability, so looking at how infrastructure, humans, ecosystems, and our trees interact. And we're using a worksheet approach where individual managers are walked through a set of questions about the regional impacts and what about their system in particular might make them more or less vulnerable. It allows them to divide this assessment up by geographic areas or different residential versus commercial zones. We're looking at the physical, biological, and the interactions with human factors as far as impacts. And then for adaptive capacity, we're looking at the biological adaptive capacity of the trees, but also the adaptive capacity of our organizations, the economic adaptive capacity of systems, and the social adaptive capacity. And tomorrow we're going to be piloting this approach with a group of municipalities, park districts, and forest preserve districts right here in this room. And after that, we'll have a much better sense of how it worked and what we know. So in summary, vulnerability assessments are a key step in adapting to climate change. Our assessment approach for natural ecosystems has been tested and used widely throughout the Midwest. we have found that generally in these assessments that oak-dominated systems tend to receive lower vulnerability, and these high elevation and boreal systems tend to be considered most vulnerable. And then we are developing this assessment approach for urban systems and for urban trees. And I gave you a little overview of our adaptive capacity scoring approach, and this is all still in progress. And then we'll be piloting our new approach for assessing vulnerability of urban forests tomorrow.